So again, good morning and Shavua Tov. We would like to begin this shiur, which is, I believe, much on a much happier, merrier subject than last week's. It's always better to speak about birth than the other way around. And so for today is more of a halachic practical one, although I hope to touch some more hashkafic points as we would come to the conclusion of the shiur. But mostly, and it will be on the question of giving birth on Shabbat. What I would like to do is to begin with the principles of what we call pikuach nefesh on Shabbat, and then move on to the specifics of birth, of what we call in Hebrew leida, and see if is it a classic case of pikuach nefesh, of saving on Shabbat, or is it something that maybe is unique? We hope that we'll be able to explore today, and also to touch upon some of the very practical questions that are being asked many times over birth on Shabbat. I mean, the question is very common, not necessarily because there are so many births on Shabbatot. It's, I guess, statistically 1 of 7, but because we don't know when the birth would be usually. So people are asking the questions because they need to know what would happen if. And we'll speak also about planning ahead, which is obviously a very important thing in life in general, and obviously regarding our topic for today. The shiur is recorded on YouTube. So Bezat Hashem, we would also post the YouTube recording after the shiur ends. So I am sharing with you So as I said, I will begin with the question, the general question of saving on Shabbat. Before we go into the more specific topic of birth on Shabbat, I would like to begin with the question of pikuach, what we call pikuach nefesh on Shabbat. Now, the words pikuach nefesh themselves, where they are coming from. So pikuach nefesh is coming from a very specific case, which is discussed in the Gemara, which is a case in which there is an earthquake or any other reason, and the building comes crashing down on its habitants. And then we have maybe we have survivors down beneath the rubble. Are you allowed to remove the rubble? Chilul Shabbat deoraita, are you allowed to do so for the sake of saving the people that are underneath the stones? And the halacha is that yes, you are allowed. That is called lefakeach et hagal, to remove the wave of stones, literally. So to remove the stones, and from there this term came to be known as pikuach nefesh. But now the Gemara tells us the story of what were the origins of the biblical sources of this permission to break the Shabbat for the sake of saving life. And the Gemara says, כבר היה רבי ישמעאל ורבי עקיבא ורבי אלעזר בן עזריה מהלכין בדרך. So Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, these important sages, they are walking together. And what would the sages do when they walk together? Obviously, they would speak on Divrei Torah. They would discuss halacha. ולוי הסדר ורבי ישמעאל בנו של רבי אלעזר בן עזריה מהלכים אחריהם. So they were walking, and behind them would be the son of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Levi Hasadar. We don't know exactly who he was, but it seems to be he was a student of them. נשאלה שאלה זו בפניהם, and as this entourage is walking, so there was a question that was debated. What was the question? מניין לפיקוח נפש שדוחה So how do we know that pikuach nefesh, again, if we translate that, that's a figurative way of speaking. We translate that into pikuach nefesh is saving life. How do we that saving life, the act of saving life, is overriding the halachot of Shabbat? You are allowed to desecrate the Shabbat for the sake of saving life. Now, they are giving a few different sources, so there is a dispute regarding the exact source used for this learning that we are allowed to desecrate the Shabbat for the sake of. But there are two main sources that are later, that they are, we may say, vindicated in later generations. Is a source given by Rabbi Shimon ben Menasia. And Rabbi Shimon ben Menasia says, "Amru bnei Israel et haShabbat." So it says, "Veshamru," they should keep the Shabbat. Why the Shabbat? Why not the Shabbatot? We are not just commanded over one Shabbat to be keeping with all of the Shabbatot. So why do we say Veshameru bnei Israel et haShabbat, the Shabbat? So he understands that that means that sometimes to desecrate one Shabbat for the sake of another. So so if you would save his life by doing a melacha, by doing work, forbidden work, this Shabbat, then you would add in some final math, in some final, you would add Shmirat Shabbat to the word and not Chas v'Chaila subtract. So that's his explanation. So why it says hashkafa, because sometimes you pay with one Shabbat for the sake of. That's one explanation of this as a source. So according to that, how to break the Shabbat for the sake of keeping other Shabbatot. Obviously, that is not up to our, let's say maybe I am allowed to go around on Shabbat in a car and beam from megaphones, right? A few of Shabbat. Why? Because I would desecrate in Shabbat, but more people would keep other Shabbat. So I'm not allowed to do so. It's not my personal calculation to make. But Am Israel as a nation, the sages, as our leaders, had decided that in a case of real urgency, you are allowed to break the Shabbat for the sake of future Shabbatot. Now, some of you may remember that last week when we spoke about the life of a fetus who is still in a womb, in his mother's womb, then you are allowed to break the Shabbat in order to save his life. Oh, maybe he's not considered completely alive. Now the reason is because what we are being told here, says some of the Rishonim, meaning that how to desecrate the Shabbat for this potential of life, because this is a potential for the keeping of many more Shabbatot in the future. So that is one source. That is one source of for Torah why we are allowed to break the Shabbat for the sake of other Shabbatot and for the sake of keeping life. Another source, a very well-known one, is not specifically tailored for Shabbat, but is approving the transgression of Torah laws, all Torah laws, part of, as we know, the Avodah Zarah, idolatry, Gilui Arayot, forbidden sexual relationship, and Shpichut Damim, bloodshed. So part of these three, you are allowed to break any law in the Torah to save life, and that is because the Torah said, "Ushmartem et chukotai ve'et mishpatai asher ya'aseh otam ha'adam." So we need to keep the laws and the judgments of the Torah that God gave us. And that is because we are supposed to live according to Torah laws. So if you are supposed to live according to laws, to live, not to die because of Torah laws. So in the case that observing one of the laws would cause one's death, then he is not supposed, maybe he's not even allowed to keep this halacha. So summarizing what we saw two reasons why one is allowed to break the Shabbat or any other law of the Torah, part of the big three, for the sake of saving life. One is out of a calculation. We would call that maybe a more utilitarian approach. We say we are willing to pay a small price now for a big profit. And the other is not a utilitarian approach, but an approach of value. And it says value of life is overriding, is overcoming the value of any specific mitzvah. So you're not when it is not a clear immediate danger. So that's the general issue. What about Shabbat? What do I mean by asking what about Shabbat? I mean to ask, when we say that you are allowed to desecrate the Shabbat for the sake of saving someone's life? That we saw just now in the Gemara, that is clear. The only question is what is the source? But it is clear that one is allowed to do so. What we are right now asking is that is the consideration of pikuach nefesh overshadowing the consideration of Shabbat. That is, in a case in which I have to break the Shabbat in order to save life, should I be, let's put it that way, should I be sad for the Shabbat that is being created? But, okay, value I must attend. Or I say, Shabbat is not even a consideration when we talk about saving. That's something that we take into account when we are in a two options have code names. The other code name is hutra, or permitted, allowed. The first code name, dchuya, means being living life. But it is still here. Shabbat is still being dead. The other competing concept is that Shabbat is hutra, meaning it is completely permitted. When we are in a tzara, when we are in saving lives mode, then Shabbat is not on radar. It is completely wiped out of existence. It's like a weekday. Now, this is a very old question. One interesting manifestation of it was being discussed by the Rashba, Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderet, in the 40th century in Spain. And he himself is already quoting answers. And the specific question he's dealing with is, let's imagine that we have a sick person. And the doctor says, this sick person must eat meat. That's, in order to eat meat, that's a danger for his life. Fine, obviously he's allowed to eat meat. We have two options. One is, there is a treif meat. I can go to the shop, buy treif meat, and he would eat it. The other option is, I will shecht an animal, on Shabbat, and cook it, and then he would eat kosher meat. Which one do they prefer? Now, there is an prohibition on any one of these options, on any activities. Why? Because eating treif meat is a be confused by what I'm saying now. It is completely prohibited to eat treif meat if there are any doubts. But the scale of humra, of severity, of prohibitions, eating treif meat is on a lower state than breaking the Shabbat. Because eating treif meat is punished only by lashes, by malkot, and breaking the Shabbat, you would be stoned for that. So that's killer. That's much more severe. So there is a reason to say that it is better if this sick person must break the Torah law. Either he would eat treif or he would break the Shabbat. It is better that he would eat treif than he would break the Shabbat. That was the position of some of the poskim. Rashba, the other poskim disagreed. They said that Shabbat is hutra, meaning in a case of danger for life, Shabbat does not play a role. You do not say, okay, there is a price to be paid here, there is a price to be paid, there is a price, let's take the lower price. There is no price to be paid. Meaning to say, in a case I break the Shabbat for someone's life, that is not breaking the Shabbat. Eating treif is eating treif under any circumstances, even if it is allowed, but it's treif meat. But breaking the Shabbat is not considered even a rejected issue. Allowed. So this possible, even that on theoretical level, breaking the Shabbat is more severe than eating treif, because in a specific case of pikuach nefesh, breaking the Shabbat is as an existent consideration, then I would prefer sharpening the animal, slaughtering it, cooking it, giving it to the person, and he should not eat treif meat. So these are the concept of hutra or tchuya. By the way, other poskim argued that regarding this question of should I prefer treif meat or cooking on Shabbat, it is always better to cook on Shabbat because a real Jew would not be able to eat the treif meat. He would just, it would come out because it's on the psychological level. And he would not be cured by that. So they argued, regardless of how do you see the Shabbat, the reasons of pikuach you to prefer slaughtering and cooking on Shabbat than giving him treif meat. So that's an interesting whole question to itself. But this concept, this discussion of should we prefer tchuya or hutra, meaning should we see desecrating the Shabbat for the sake of pikuach nefesh as something that we should cringe about, or as something that is completely allowed, that's a big question that was never completely resolved. That's a very important note. It was never completely resolved, and to this day, there are differing opinions. So when I, for example, instruct my students in the yeshiva, my bachurim in the yeshiva, before going to the army, and they know they would have to break the Shabbat for the sake of pikuach nefesh, obviously. They have to break the Shabbat during their service in the army. So how should they feel about that? That's an interesting question. How should they go about it? Should they say, we are performing a mitzvah and Shabbat is not a consideration even? Or should they have some sadness for being by necessity, but being forced to break the Shabbat? That's a real question. That's a real question that has many, many implications. Now, there are those who argue that this question is the source of the following dispute between the Shulchan Aruch and maybe the Sephardic tradition on one hand, and Rema and maybe the Ashkenazic tradition on the other hand. And that is the following halacha in the Shulchan Aruch. שמחללים שבת על חולה שיש בו סכנה. So when we have to break the Shabbat for the sake of the person who is in danger, his life is in danger. Okay, so it is completely clear that we should break the Shabbat. But what should we prefer to do the work? Is it preferable that, let's say, maybe a minor beneath the age of 13 would do that? Maybe we should prefer that a would treat the sick person. Said the Shulchan Aruch, no. It is preferable the Jewish people that are gdolim, meaning that they are in the above the age of 13, and that they are knowledgeable in the halachot of Shabbat, to perform the melech. So even if I am able to use a non-Jew, says the Shulchan Aruch, it is preferable to use a Jew. Now, there may be different reasons too. Why? But many speakers in the Shulchan Aruch is falling on the side that consideration when we speak about pikuach nefesh. So there is no aveira involved, and there is a big mitzvah. So we prefer the mitzvah to be performed by Jews and not by non-Jews or by minors. That's the Shulchan Aruch. But the Rema disagrees. So the Rema, in his remark, he of the opinion, ויש אומרים, שאם אפשר לעשות בלא דיחוי ובלא איחור על ידי שינוי, עושה על ידי שינוי the Rema. If the treatment would not be damaged or downgraded in any way, then it is preferred that you do the melacha, you do the work on Shabbat with some change. If you are changing the manner in which you do the melacha, so for example, if you are writing with your left hand instead of your right, let's say that usually you write with your right hand, and now you write with your left hand. That is a change, and that is downgrading the severity of the desecration of Shabbat. And if it is possible to do it by a non-Jew, again, without delay, it is preferable, he says, to bring a non-Jew. So if I have to take someone to the hospital on Shabbat, there is some pikuach nefesh situation. So if there is an available non-Jew that can drive, the Shulchan Aruch says, no, take the Jew to drive. The Rema says, if it would cause no delay, take the non-Jew. So the Rema, it seems, hold that there is a problem in desecrating the Shabbat for pikuach nefesh. We should do that, but if we can minimize it, we must minimize it. While the Shulchan Aruch holds that when things are being done for the sake of pikuach nefesh, then Shabbat is not a consideration. Now, again, there are other explanations to this dispute, but that seems to be a very good example of this very different attitude to the question of pikuach nefesh on Shabbat. Should we see Shabbat completely shoved aside, non-existent, or are we to consider the Shabbat and try to see and try to minimize the harm to the observant of Shabbat, even in situation of pikuach nefesh? Again, only in the case, obviously, that treatment and it does not cause any delay on the part of the caregiver. So all of that was a general introduction to the halachot of pikuach nefesh on Shabbat. What about labor? What about a woman giving birth on Shabbat? The Shulchan Aruch pasken in a very clear and concise way. Source direct. יולדת היא כחולה שיש בו סכנה. So a woman is to be considered as a sick person with a danger to his or her life. Consequently, מחללים עליה את השבת לכל מה שצריכה. So everything that she needs should be performed even on Shabbat. And that would include calling a מיילדת. Say מיילדת?
Sorry, a midwife.
Midwife, thank you. Yeah. So a midwife. So you are allowed to call a wife from place to place. And obviously she would have, I don't know, to ride a horse or to go by a car in our times. Everything is fine. And you light a candle. We will return to this candle later. But says the Shulchan Aruch, מכל מקום, however, בכל מה שיכול לשנות, משנים. So if there is a possibility, again, to minimize the desecration of Shabbat, you should minimize. So for example, let's say that you must bring some oil for the sake, for I don't know, they were using oil back then. So you must bring oil, but there is a problem that you don't have oil in the house where the woman is giving the birth. So you must bring the oil from somewhere else. And as you know, if there is no eruv, there is a problem with bringing from one house through the street to another. It's called melechet hotza'ah, taking out from one house to the street, or from the street to another house. Then, if it is possible, it says you can bring the oil in the. That's a very interesting idea. It says you can tie it in her friend's hair. So that's as I said, a shinui. That's a change. That's not the usual way how you take vessels, that you tie them to your hair. So that's I guess that you need hair in order to be able to tie to. So I'm disqualified for that. But people are usually hair friends, meaning she friends, which one now means. So they would have hair to which they can tie the vessel, and that would be a way how to again minimize the desecration of Shabbat. Now, just a moment. Didn't we say earlier that according to the Shulchan Aruch, when there is an emergency, a life-endangering situation, you don't need to make any changes? We have said that according to the Shulchan Aruch, Shabbat is putra, meaning it is completely allowed. You should not take action to minimize the desecration of Shabbat in a case of life emergency. So what is going on here? Why does it say that to make a shinui, a change in the work, in order to minimize the desecration of Shabbat? To explain the Mishnah Berurah, that even that according to the Shulchan Aruch, in the usual case of life emergency, there is no need to do any change. Later, labor, giving birth is different. Why? מפני שכאב היולדת דבר טבעי הוא. He says, that's not a disease, that's not an unnatural thing. Pregnancy and birth are not disease. They may be life-threatening situations, we'll see in a minute, but they are not being seen as disease. And meta mechamat leida. So the Mishnah Berurah says, and that's a quoting from the Maggid Mishneh. So that's a quote from, let's say, the 40th century Egypt. He said that even 1 out of 1,000 women do not die during giving birth. So that's a very interesting number. It was discussed by many studies how to approach that. Obviously, Baruch Hashem, in the states in which you have modernized medicine, then we speak about much less than 1 death, 2,000 labors. But when we speak about what we call the developing countries, even today, in some places in Africa, There are more than 1 to 1,000, meaning one death to 1,000 births. So it is dangerous. It is dangerous. But on the other hand, it's not as dangerous, I guess, as other diseases. So that's why we may approach it. It's not, if I would give my spin on that, on what the Mishnah Berurah is saying here. He says, birth is not an immediate situation of danger to life, but it may develop to one. So on one hand, you are allowed and you are required to desecrate the Shabbat in order to prevent the situation from developing to a life-threatening situation. But on the other hand, as it is not life-threatening right now, obviously in normal birth, if it's already developed to life-endangering situation. But in normal birth, it's only the danger of it becoming a life-threatening situation. But it is not right now. So you are allowed to desecrate the Shabbat, but you must make any effort you can to minimize the harm for the Shabbat. So that is a basic halacha that we should understand regarding giving birth on Shabbat. And that is that we are required to minimize the amount of Chilul Shabbat as best as we can without any damage of the woman. So if it could cause any damage or any downgrade to the treatment, then you are not then you shouldn't change in any way. But if changing does not harm the treatment, the quality of the treatment, then we are required to try and minimize the Chilul Shabbat involved. So that's a whole self-giving on Shabbat vis-a-vis other life-threatening situations. We are stricter in the sense that we want to minimize Chilul Shabbat. And one area we're more strict, another area we giving on Shabbat. It's the whole psychological. Now the Gemara says, you remember that we saw earlier in the Shulchan Aruch that you are allowed to light a candle. Now what is this candle is doing? The Gemara explains that you are allowed to light a candle even if the midwife says she doesn't need one. So the midwife is an expert, she knows the way by heart, and she doesn't need a candle. Now, the woman who is giving the birth, she asks a candle to be lit. You should lit a candle. Although the doctor says, the midwife says, you don't need. You should lit a candle. Even, says the Gemara, even if the woman giving the birth blind, she herself cannot use the candle, and the midwife says she doesn't need the candle. Nonetheless, if she asks the candle to be, you must light a candle. Why? The Gemara says, and that's a here, I would Shabbat, I meya data, her mind, that would calm her. The Tosafot, that is not necessarily correct for other sick people. So if let's say that, I don't know, someone has corona, right? In corona. So someone has corona. And he says, I'm in corona, I must hear music. It will help me. And the doctor says, no, that's not hashkafa, that's nonsense. It wouldn't help at all. So if there is no objective basis for his, let's say that he's deaf, right? He cannot hear anyway. And he says, no, I want music because I believe that music would improve my body management of the disease. The doctor says, no, that's nonsense. We made a study and that's nonsense. So we would not play. But if a woman giving birth would ask the same request, we would play the music, although she's deaf. Why? Because we understand that in birth giving, the psychological aspect is extremely important to avoid the birth developing to chas v'chalila a life-threatening situation. Much more than a natural disease, right? As we said, that's exactly the same reason why we are strict on birth on Shabbat, is the same reason why we are more lenient. Why? Because the situation objectively is not a life-threatening situation, but it can become one. So one of our important motivations, one of our important goals is to come to pacify the woman giving birth, because that would enable her, and obviously we speak about time before, epidural, these instruments. And if the woman would go into stress and she wouldn't be able to deliver, and the baby would get stuck in the cannula, there are many complications that can arise. Some of them may be very, very dangerous. That can come not for any physical aspect, but because of psychological aspects. So if we are allowing during birth for the pacification of the woman, we are the desecration of Shabbat. Now, obviously, we should minimize that as much as we can. Minimize that as much as we can. But if the woman feels that without that, stress, and that's the end of the story. We'll do that. It may be, it's not maybe, it must be that these things should be discussed beforehand. Because many times when they are being discussed beforehand, then maybe we can avoid the desecration of Shabbat, either by finding replacements to specify the woman without breaking the Shabbat, or because she would be convinced that that object really needed. But if she stands and she insists that she needs them, even if we, regardless of who is the we here, the rest of the world, the midwife, they all say objectively that is just not needed. Nonetheless, we'll do that. Why? Because we understand that when we speak about giving birth, the psychological aspects are maybe, they are no less important, and some would say they are more important than the biological aspects. Let's go from here. These were the fundamentals. So we saw two fundamentals. One is that we should be more strict. Why? Because there is, right now in normal birth, it's not considered yet a life-threatening situation. It's only a danger of developing into one. And on the other hand, there is a reason to be more lenient. Why? Because, as we said, in case of psychological aspects, we understand the importance of the psychological side in the giving of birth. So now, every minutes, let's go into more practical questions. I would like to describe some, and I invite also questions that people may have. So let's begin. One very important, I already said a few times here, is that pre-planning would be able to solve most of the problems. In the Mishnah Berurah says, "Min ha'ra'ui leisha she'egi'a lechodesh teshi," so a woman that has reached the 9th month, להזמין בכל ערב שבת כל הדברים הנצרכים לה, she should ahead on Shabbat Eve, on Friday. So if there would be a birth on Shabbat, she wouldn't need, or at least she could minimize the breaking of Shabbat. That's very simple. It's very simple. So, for example, don't wait for Shabbat to the birth to begin, and then you ask, what can I do with the little children I have, small children I have at home? There is no one around that I can bring to without calling first or without driving them. There's no reason for that. You can speak maybe with the neighbor before and can decide. You can maybe, we are now on Corona terms, but not on Corona terms. Then you can host some relative or someone that can stay with the children at home if you have to leave. If you live here in Tel Mond, you are invited always to drop the children by us. We'll be happy to have them. But everything can be arranged. But when people come, when it's already Shabbat, and now it's Shabbat, 3 a.m., and someone knocks on my door and is asking, what can I do? Now, that's too late to begin to think about the question, what do they do with the children? Obviously, you're not allowed to leave them locked at home. That should be simple. If you pre-plan, nothing here is mysterious. It's very easy to see ahead what's going to happen. So that's an extremely important thing to do. That is to think ahead, to plan, and to do. Now, if you are able, if you're having 5 minutes walk from the hospital and you are happy to be there, they are happy to have you. There are many conditions here, but if all of them are met, that's beautiful. Then you can stay by your parents or by your in-laws or by your brothers or sister or whatever, and then just go to the hospital. Right? Usually that is not possible, but if it is possible, then obviously that's a very mehadrin thing to do. Now, another question that is very common. Should we prefer going by an ambulance or going with a car? That's a big discussion in the poskim, and there are different opinions. I usually recommend to call an ambulance. And I would explain why. I would like to explain why. There are a few considerations here. One is that basically any ambulance is better suited to, if there would be some emergency. So an ambulance is better suited. As far as I know, I didn't check it in the recent year, but as far as I know, you are allowed to call an ambulance for the sake of delivery, and there is no payment required, so it's part of the law. It's not that you are taking something that is not proper. So there is no problem. You can call an ambulance. Now, for what is nice in calling an ambulance on Shabbat, if I may say that, is that the ambulance is allowed to go back because they are needed. But if someone else is going in a car, he has a problem. Back. Even if it is not planning on coming back, it is a problem to switch off the engine when he reaches the hospital. Because that's a pikuach nefesh. But why switching off the engine is pikuach nefesh? Because you don't want your car to be stolen. That's very nice, but that's not pikuach nefesh. So in some hospitals, as in Leniado, you would have a non-Jew standing in the car parking area, and you'd switch off the car for you. Very nice. But in other, I don't know if in Meir they have such a thing. I would guess not. So that's something to consider. It's something, maybe people are relying, in the end, people are switching off the engine. Why? Because they say maybe if the car would remain turned on, it may cause the engine to explode, and that would be life-threatening to people around. I didn't ask an engineer if really a car would explode if it remains, I don't know, I think that the fuel would go out or someone would take the car. There's no, I think it's a big question. It's one very good reason to prefer an ambulance. The second question. In Laniado, yeah, in Laniado, I know they have, but I don't know if in Meir they have. Yeah, thank you. Also, if someone is in Yerushalayim, they have it in Shari Tzedek. So there are places in which they have them, but that's something to consider. Another thing to consider is that I don't have the time to go into the halachic details, but when you go in the ambulance is usually high. Why do I care that the ambulance is high? Because if it is high, it's better when you take things and you are being driving them. No, you're not the driver, but they are being drove. If the hospital is far away, there is an issue not allowed to go out and not to take our things more than a certain distance. Now, again, that's something that is slightly too complex to go now into all of the details, but the bottom line is that because the ambulance is higher, it is, according to many posts, it is not considered as a problem of tchumin if you take things in the ambulance. So that is another reason why to prefer. So that is my answer. Now, there are poskim who think otherwise. So I would say that's not a concluded matter, but I believe that it is better to use the ambulance. Next question, a very common question. We all understand that there at least must be one person accompanying the woman giving birth. Now, there is a very interesting tshuva by Reb Moshe Feinstein in the Igot Moshe, who discusses the permissibility of a taxi with a non-Jewish driver, someone going with the woman in the hospital. Now, the Igot Moshe believes that is in itself is not needed. So I don't know if in New York that was the minhag, that only the woman would go to give birth alone. It seems to me, I don't know, to me it seems very strange. At least here in Israel, it is very clear that it would be very problematic for someone to be hospitalized without anyone that is accompanying. And that is clearly and no problem at all that someone would accompany the woman. So that is clear and simple. The questions begin when she wants more than one person. So let's say that the woman giving birth wants both her husband and her mother. And the Mehadrin would also add what we call here in Israel a doula. I don't know if there is any English word for that, or is it in itself an English word? I have no idea. A doula is a woman assisting the midwife. So you do not rely, you do not trust the midwife provided by the hospital. You want to add another private midwife. Fine. Now you want to call her on Shabbat and bring her to the hospital. And you have to do that by yourself. Are you allowed to do so? Now, the answer is that objectively, as far as I know, there were no studies that proved that by bringing one's mother or even this private midwife, more lives are being saved. It seems that it would decrease the amount of pain being suffered many times, but not necessarily would save life. So objectively, it is not allowed. But here, Moshe says, come into consideration the reasoning we saw earlier, that psychological aspects in birth are extremely important. So if the woman insists and she says, no, if I would not have my mother next to me, I would go into stress. Then again, that's something that should be discussed before, and maybe we should try to alleviate the fears, but many times in first birth, they are unalleviable. So that's not necessarily something that would be possible to do. And in again, the bottom line is that if the woman is stressful and she feels that she must have her mother next to her, then we would try minimizing Chilul Shabbat as best as we can, but we would, in the end, we would grant this request. Again, trying to minimize as best as we can, and trying to convince her before that it is not needed. But if, in the end, the Rav would get the impression that the woman is so stressed that not having a mother or not having this private midwife, the doula, next to her would be stressful, then he would allow that, although he may it is not really available. Okay. So that's which is based on the Gemara that we saw earlier. Very see. Yeah. If there are any more questions that you would like to ask, then if not, then we would finish with some hashkafic points. Okay. Now, next, we want to conclude by, so in the end, being born on Shabbat, giving birth on Shabbat, is it preferable or is it a nice thing or is it not a nice thing? Obviously, failure. So the Sefer Hasidim, Rabbi Yehuda Hasid, in the 12th century Germany, writes, מי שאשתו מעוברת, so if someone has his wife is pregnant, והגיע החודש התשיעי, and now the 9th month is here, התפלל את אשתו בשבת, so he should pray that his wife would not give birth on Shabbat. So if he is offered the פתיחת הארון on Shabbat morning, he says, no, not on Shabbat, on Monday and Thursday. That's the view of Sefer Hasidim. שלא יחללו שבת in order to discredit the Shabbat. וכן על ביתו וכלתו, and don't only, why should you pray only for your wife? Also pray for your daughter that you not give birth on Shabbat and for your daughter-in-law. And he says, אחד היה מתפלל בתפילת מנחה בערב, we know about someone, in 12th century in Germany, that every mincha of ערב Shabbat, he would have his special tefillah. What would be the special tefillah? שלא תיפול דליקה בשבת, ושלא תלדנה אנשים בשבת. So interesting. So he says, his tefillah was, that should be on Shabbat, because then we would need, in order to put off the fire, to extinguish the fire, we need to break the Shabbat, and no woman would give birth. So he would equal these two things. So having fire and giving birth. Fine, okay. So that's one approach. So yes, it is better for us if we can completely avoid giving birth on Shabbat. Because it would then we would be able not to desecrate the Shabbat. On the other hand, the Gemara on Shabbat Kuf Nun Vav Amud Aleph says, "Ayman de b'Shabtai b'Shabtai yamut, v'dachilu alo yom haraba de Shabta." The Gemara says, "Whom that was born on Shabbat would also die on Shabbat 120 years later, but would also die on Shabbat. Why? Because it's like the Shabbat taking revenge. You were born on Shabbat, and by that you caused the desecration of Shabbat. So after 120, after 120 years, you would also die on Shabbat." Okay. And then the Gemara says, Shina v'kadisha. So this person that was born on Shabbat and now died on Shabbat, he would called Kiddush Rabbah. He would called a great Kadosh, a great holy man. Because he was born on the holiest day. So, I prefer giving birth. No, if you're he's holy. So it seems that the answer is that for the parents, it is better not to give birth on Shabbat. That's just more headache. But for the newborn, it is better to be born on Shabbat because then he's holy. So that's just one more conflict, I guess, between the child and his parents. That's an about giving birth on like to but it already ends, then that's a very good sign of Kedusha, it's a sign of holiness, and there should be Be'ezrat Hashem many semachot with as much holiness as possible. So I have a very good week. Now, just one small technical announcement. Hashem, I hope that we'll have a show next week. But the week after that, I may be in Miluim. It's not completely clear, and as you can understand, right now everything here is in the air. But I would, Bezat Hashem, I would give you an announcement later. But take note that it may be that 2 weeks from now we will not have a show. So have a and a good day. Bye.